Hello everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The Voice That Follows, from Marcus Rivers. The CB radio in my Kenworth has been crackling with the same voice for 300 miles now, and I'm starting to think it might be following me rather than the other way around. It started somewhere outside of Tucumcari, New Mexico, just after midnight when the desert stretched endlessly in all directions like a black ocean, punctuated only by the occasional distant glow of ranch lights. I'd been hauling refrigerated produce from California to Dallas, making good time on Interstate 40, despite the late autumn chill that had settled over the high desert. The heater hummed steadily, mixing with the familiar drone of my Cummins engine, creating that lullaby that keeps long-haul drivers sane during the loneliest hours of the night. Channel 19 had been unusually quiet for a Friday evening, with only the occasional exchange between drivers comparing fuel prices or warning about speed traps. I'd been listening to the gentle static for company, occasionally keying up to check in with other drivers when the voice first appeared. It was soft, almost whispered, barely distinguishable from the background noise of the radio waves traveling across the vastness of the Southwest. Eastbound Kenworth, you copy? The transmission was weak, filled with that peculiar hollow quality that comes from signals bouncing off the atmosphere in the deep desert night. I glanced at my mirrors, seeing only the red glow of my own trailer light stretching behind me, and the empty highway disappearing into darkness. No other trucks were visible, but that didn't mean much out here where you could drive for 20 miles without seeing another soul. "This is the eastbound KW," I responded, adjusting my squelch to clear up the static. "You got me. Go ahead." For several seconds, nothing came back except the gentle hiss of empty airwaves. Then, just as I was reaching to change channels, the voice returned, clearer now, but still maintaining that strange, distant quality that made it sound like it was coming from very far away. "Beautiful night for driving, isn't it, Marcus?" The use of my name made me pause, my hand freezing halfway to the channel selector. It wasn't uncommon for drivers to know each other's names, especially if you ran the same routes regularly. But something about the way this voice said it felt different. Too intimate. Too knowing. I tried to place the voice but couldn't match it to any of the regulars I knew from this corridor. "Do I know you, driver?" I asked, keeping my tone friendly despite the slight unease creeping up my spine. "You sound familiar, but I can't place the voice." "We haven't met," came the reply, followed by what might have been a chuckle or just more static. "But I've been listening to you for a while now. You have such interesting conversations." I tried to remember what conversations I'd had recently on the radio, but most had been routine check-ins about road conditions or brief exchanges with dispatchers. Nothing particularly interesting or memorable. The digital clock on my dashboard read 12:47 a.m., its blue glow the only light in the cab except for the dim radiance of my instrument panel and the headlight beams cutting through the desert darkness ahead. "Well, I appreciate the company," I said, though I was already starting to feel less appreciative and more curious about why this unknown driver seemed to know me. "What are you hauling tonight, and where are you headed?" "Same direction as you," the voice replied without answering the first part of my question. "Same road, same destination. We have so much in common, Marcus." I checked my mirrors again, this time more carefully, looking for any sign of headlights behind me or ahead. The highway remained empty in both directions, stretching like a ribbon across the high desert under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The only movement was the steady progression of mile markers and the occasional tumbleweed that danced across my headlight beams before disappearing back into the darkness. "I don't see you out here," I said, trying to keep the conversation light while a growing sense of unease began to settle in my stomach. "Where exactly are you running?" "Closer than you think," came the response, and this time I was certain I heard something that might have been laughter. though it was distorted by the static in a way that made it sound more like wind through a canyon than human mirth. I decided to try a different approach and switched to channel 17, one of the alternate channels drivers sometimes used for clearer conversations. The static cleared immediately, leaving blessed silence except for the steady hum of tires on asphalt and the gentle vibration of the diesel engine pulling my load through the night. I drove in peace for about 10 minutes, letting the radio scan other channels to see if I could pick up any normal traffic. Then the voice appeared on channel 17, as clear as if the speaker was sitting in my passenger seat. That wasn't very friendly, Marcus. I was enjoying our conversation. My hands tightened on the steering wheel and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. I switched to channel 15, then to channel 21, but each time within minutes the voice would find me, always speaking my name with that same unsettling familiarity, always claiming to be nearby but never visible on the empty highway that stretched endlessly ahead and behind me. "How are you doing this?" I finally asked, my voice betraying more irritation than I intended. "Are you some kind of skip shooter? Because this isn't funny anymore." Skip shooting was the term for radio operators who used illegal amplifiers to broadcast over long distances, sometimes thousands of miles, but even that didn't explain how this person seemed to know exactly which channel I was monitoring, or why they seemed so interested in maintaining contact specifically with me. "I'm not shooting, Skip," the voice replied, and for the first time, it sounded slightly offended. "I'm right here with you, Marcus. Can't you feel me?" The question sent an actual shiver down my spine, and I found myself checking not just my mirrors but also glancing at the passenger seat and the sleeper berth behind me, even though I knew I was alone. The cab suddenly felt smaller, more confining despite being the same spacious Kenworth I'd called home for the past 3 years. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every reflected light from my dashboard seemed to create shapes that shouldn't have been there. I tried turning the radio off completely, but even with the power button in the off position, the voice continued to come through, speaking my name in that same soft, persistent tone that was beginning to feel less like conversation and more like an incantation. The volume knob did nothing to quiet it, nor did adjusting the squelch or switching between AM and SSB modes. "Marcus, don't shut me out," the voice pleaded as I desperately tried various combinations of controls to stop the transmission. "I've been so lonely out here. We all have. It gets so quiet in the desert at night, and your voice has been such a comfort to us." The word "us" struck me like a physical blow, and I realized that if I listened carefully to the static behind the main voice, I could hear what might have been whispers, dozens of them, all speaking at once in words I couldn't quite make out, but that filled me with a dread so profound I had to fight to keep the truck in my lane. Mile marker 273 flashed past in my headlights, and I calculated that I still had nearly 200 miles before I reached Amarillo and the relative safety of civilization. The thought of listening to this voice or voices for another 3 hours made my skin crawl, but there seemed to be no way to escape it. Even when I tried tuning to AM radio stations for music, the voice would fade in and out between songs, always speaking my name, always claiming to be nearby, always asking questions about my route, my cargo, my plans. "Where will you stop for fuel, Marcus?" the voice asked as I passed a sign indicating that the next truck stop was 47 miles ahead in Amarillo. "Will you be stopping soon?" I had been planning to fuel up in Amarillo, but something about the eager way the voice asked made me reconsider. Instead, I decided to push through to Oklahoma City, even though it would strain my fuel capacity and my logbook hours. The thought of stopping anywhere while this mysterious voice was tracking my movements seemed like a terrible idea. "Just driving through the night," I replied, trying to sound casual while my heart hammered against my ribs. "No stops planned." "That's too bad," the voice responded, and this time the disappointment sounded genuine, almost childlike. "We were hoping to meet you. We've prepared such a welcome." The highway began a gradual climb toward Amarillo, and I could see the glow of the city on the horizon, a reassuring bubble of light in the vast darkness of the Texas Panhandle. As I got closer to civilization, I noticed that the voice was becoming fainter, though still audible, and the static was increasing. The weight of dreams. From Marcus, the CB radio had been crackling with warnings about wait stations being extra vigilant that week. But I figured my manifest was clean and my load properly distributed, so I pressed on through the Nevada desert with nothing but the steady hum of my Peterbilt's engine and the distant glow of Vegas behind me. What I hadn't counted on was picking up a hitchhiker at that lonely truck stop outside of Beatty, a thin man in work clothes who claimed he just needed a ride to Tonopah to meet his crew in the morning. He introduced himself as Dale, spoke in a soft drawl that reminded me of my grandfather, and had the kind of weathered hands that told stories of honest labor. There was something calming about his presence. The way he settled into the passenger seat without fuss, how he didn't feel the need to fill every silence with chatter, like some riders do. He mentioned he'd been working construction jobs across the Southwest for the better part of 20 years, following the work wherever it led him. And that resonated with me since trucking had taken me down similar, wandering paths. The night stretched on with that comfortable quiet that sometimes develops between strangers who understand the rhythm of the road. Dale dozed off somewhere past the Goldfield exit, his breathing steady and peaceful, and I found myself appreciating the company, even in his sleep. There's something about having another person in the cab that makes those long midnight stretches feel less isolating, less like you're the only soul moving through an endless dark void. It was around 3 in the morning when I pulled into a rest area to grab some sleep before the final push to Reno. The place was typical of those small Nevada stops. Just a concrete picnic table, a couple of broken streetlights, and enough space for maybe 6 trucks to park without blocking each other. Only one other rig was there when I arrived, an older Kenworth with a white trailer that had seen better days, parked at the far end under a flickering light that cast everything in intermittent shadows. Dale stirred when I killed the engine, blinking slowly in that disoriented way people do when waking up in unfamiliar places. He asked where we were and I told him, mentioning that I planned to sleep for about 4 hours before continuing on to Tonopah in the morning. He nodded and said that sounded fine, that he could use the rest himself. But then he paused and looked out toward the other truck with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That's Jimmy's rig," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made me glance over at the Kenworth again. "Haven't seen him in a while. Mind if I go say hello? We worked together on a job in Arizona last spring." I told him to go ahead, that I'd probably be asleep by the time he got back, and watched him climb down from the cab and walk across the gravel lot toward the other truck. The flickering streetlight made his silhouette dance and waver as he moved, and I found myself following his progress until he reached the Kenworth and knocked softly on the driver's side door. When there was no immediate response, he tried the handle and the door swung open with a rusty creak that I could hear even from my cab. Dale climbed up into the other truck, and I lost sight of him, though I could see a faint glow from inside the cab, probably from a dome light or maybe Jimmy's phone. I figured they were catching up, sharing stories and coffee, the way drivers do when they cross paths in these lonely places. The thought made me smile as I adjusted my seat and prepared to settle in for some sleep, but something nagged at me as I lay there listening to the desert wind whistle around the trucks and the intermittent buzz of that faulty streetlight. Dale had been asleep for hours during our drive, deeply asleep from what I could tell. Yet he'd woken up immediately when I stopped the engine and seemed instantly alert, not groggy or confused the way most people are after sleeping in a moving vehicle. And there had been something about the way he'd recognized the other truck so quickly in the dim light, as if he'd been expecting to find it there. The minutes stretched into an hour, then longer, and Dale still hadn't returned. I considered walking over to check on him, but something held me back, a feeling that I couldn't quite name but that made me reluctant to leave the safety of my cab. Instead, I found myself watching the Kenworth through my windshield, noting how still it was, how the light inside had dimmed to just a barely visible glow, and how the trailer seemed to sag slightly on its suspension as if carrying an unusually heavy load. It was then that I noticed my own truck felt different, heavier somehow, as if my cargo had shifted or increased in weight while I'd been sitting there. The sensation was subtle at first, just a feeling that the Peterbilt was settling deeper into the gravel, but it became more pronounced as the night wore on. I checked my gauges and everything read normal, but the truck definitely felt like it was carrying more weight than when I'd arrived at the rest.
Stop. A chill that had nothing
to do with the desert night air began to creep up my spine as I realized that Dale still hadn't come back, and that the other truck remained absolutely motionless under that flickering light. I tried to convince myself that the two men were probably just talking, maybe sharing a meal, or looking at photos on Jimmy's phone, but the complete stillness of the scene felt wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight and forced myself to climb down from the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel as I made my way across the lot toward the Kenworth. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to become, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on me with increasing weight. The truck's engine was cool to the touch when I reached it, suggesting it had been parked there for quite some time, and when I shined my light through the passenger window, I could see that the cab was empty, but the trailer behind it was another story entirely. As I walked alongside it, I could hear something that made my breath catch in my throat. A sound like dozens of people breathing in perfect unison, slow and rhythmic and deeply peaceful. The trailer's rear doors were slightly ajar, and a warm, humid air drifted out carrying the scent of sleep and dreams and something else I couldn't identify. But that made every instinct I had scream at me to run. I should have listened to those instincts. Should have returned to my truck and driven away immediately, but curiosity and concern for Dale kept me frozen there beside the trailer, listening to that impossible sound of synchronized breathing. When I finally worked up the courage to pull one of the doors open wider, my flashlight beam revealed an interior that defied explanation. The trailer was filled with sleeping figures, dozens of them lying on simple cots arranged in neat rows, all breathing in that same slow, peaceful rhythm. They were dressed in work clothes similar to what Dale wore, and their faces in the dim light looked relaxed and content, as if they were experiencing the most restful sleep of their lives. And there, in a cot near the back, was Dale himself, already settled in and breathing with the same peaceful cadence as the others. The weight I'd been feeling, the sense that my own truck had grown heavier, suddenly made terrible sense as I realized that something had been added to my trailer as well. I backed away from the Kenworth and ran to my own rig, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock on my trailer doors. When I got them open, I found exactly what I'd feared. More cots, more sleeping figures, all breathing in that same unnaturally synchronized pattern. They weren't dead, these sleeping people, but they weren't exactly alive in any way I understood either. They seemed caught in some perfect state between waking and dreaming, their faces peaceful but somehow empty, as if whatever made them who they were had drifted away on the currents of sleep. And I could feel it calling to me too, that overwhelming desire to lie down among them, to close my eyes and join that perfect, restful chorus of breathing. I slammed the trailer door shut and ran for my cab, my heart pounding as I started the engine and threw the truck into gear. The Peterbilt felt sluggish under the additional weight, and I could hear soft sounds coming from the trailer as we pulled away from the rest stop, gentle murmurs and sighs that spoke of deep contentment and dreams that would never end. I drove straight through to Reno without stopping, delivered my original cargo as scheduled, and tried to figure out what to do about my unwanted passengers. But when I finally worked up the courage to open the trailer doors again in the bright Nevada morning, I found nothing inside except empty space and the lingering scent of sleep. The authorities found the abandoned Kenworth 3 days later, its trailer empty except for rows of unused cots and a logbook that showed deliveries to truck stops and rest areas across 7 states. The mirror that sees too much. From Jake Morrison. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 hours now, drumming against my windshield in that hypnotic rhythm that makes long hauls feel like meditation. My Peterbilt 379 hummed contentedly down Interstate 80, its 18 wheels cutting through puddles that reflected the occasional neon glow of distant truck stops. I'd been driving this route between Denver and Chicago for 12 years, and I knew every mile marker, every rest area, every peculiar bend in the road that could catch a drowsy driver off guard. What I didn't know was that my rearview mirror had begun to malfunction in the most unsettling way possible. It started around midnight, somewhere in the endless stretch of Nebraska farmland where the darkness seems to swallow everything beyond your headlight beams. I was adjusting the mirror, trying to get a better view of a car that had been tailgating me for the past few miles when I noticed something odd. The reflection seemed clearer than it should have been, almost unnaturally sharp considering the rain and the poor lighting conditions. The car behind me was a dark sedan, maybe a Ford or Chevy, though it was hard to tell in the murky conditions. What struck me as strange was how perfectly I could see the driver's silhouette despite the distance and weather. Usually, all you could make out were headlights and maybe the vague outline of a windshield, but this was different. I could see the person's shoulders, the way they gripped the steering wheel, even what appeared to be the collar of their jacket. I blinked hard, thinking fatigue might be playing tricks with my eyes, but the clarity remained. If anything, it seemed to be getting sharper, as if the mirror was somehow magnifying the image beyond what should have been physically possible. The driver appeared to be wearing a dark coat or jacket, and their posture was unnaturally rigid, both hands fixed on the wheel in a perfect 10-2 position. The engine of my Peterbilt continued its steady rumble, a comforting bass note that had lulled me through countless nights on the road. But now, even that familiar sound couldn't shake the growing unease that was settling in my chest like cold fog. I reached for my CB radio, thinking I might check in with other drivers, but the static that greeted me was unusually thick, filled with what sounded almost like whispers beneath the electronic hiss. When I looked back at the mirror, the sedan was still there, maintaining that same precise distance, but now I could see something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The driver's face was visible, pale and gaunt, with dark hollow spaces where the eyes should have been. The features were sharp, almost skeletal, and there was something wrong with the way the head was positioned, tilted at an angle that suggested the neck might be broken. I told myself it was just shadows and poor lighting creating an optical illusion, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The mirror was showing me details that shouldn't have been visible from this distance in these conditions. It was as if I was looking through a telescope rather than a standard rearview mirror, but the magnification was selective, focusing only on things I didn't want to see. The Nebraska landscape rolled by in endless waves of darkness, broken only by the occasional farmhouse light or grain elevator silhouette. The rain continued its steady percussion, creating rivulets that raced across my side windows like tiny rivers seeking the sea. My CB crackled occasionally with distant conversations between other drivers, but their voices seemed muffled and far away, as if they were broadcasting from another dimension. I tried changing lanes, thinking the sedan would pass me, but it followed, my movements with mechanical precision, maintaining that exact same distance. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I sped up, it matched my pace perfectly. But it was what I saw in the rearview mirror during these maneuvers that truly chilled my blood. The driver's head had begun to turn, slowly rotating to face forward, but the movement was wrong, too fluid, as if the neck had no bones or joints to limit its motion. And as the face came into clearer view, I realized with horror that what I had taken for hollow eye sockets were actually eyes that had rolled back completely, showing only the whites, which gleamed with an unnatural phosphorescent glow. My mouth went dry and I found myself breathing in short, shallow gasps. The familiar comfort of my truck's cab suddenly felt claustrophobic, The dashboard lights too dim, the shadows in the corners too deep. The heater was running perfectly, but I felt cold, the kind of cold that starts in your bones and spreads outward like ice crystals forming on a window. I reached up to adjust the mirror again, hoping to break whatever strange optical effect was causing these impossible visions. But as my fingers touched the glass, something extraordinary happened. The image zoomed in even further, as if responding to my touch, and suddenly I was looking directly into the sedan's interior with crystal clarity. The driver was definitely not human, or at least not anymore. Its skin had a waxy, translucent quality, and I could see dark veins running beneath the surface like cracks in aged porcelain. The mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous, arranged in rows like a shark's. But it was the eyes that held me transfixed, those terrible white orbs that seemed to be looking directly back at me through the mirror, as if it knew I was watching. The thing's lips began to move, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. It was calling my name, over and over, in a voice that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to something primal and terrified deep within my brain. The sound seemed to vibrate through the mirror itself, creating tiny ripples across its surface like waves on a disturbed pond. I jerked my hand away from the mirror, and immediately the image returned to normal distance. But the sedan was still there, still following with that same mechanical precision. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and sweat was beading on my forehead despite the cold I felt in my bones. The CB radio crackled again, and this time I could swear I heard my name mixed in with the static. The next truck stop was 15 miles ahead, a 24-hour facility called Murphy's that I'd stopped at countless times before. I decided to pull in, thinking that surely the sedan wouldn't follow me into a brightly lit public area. But as I signaled for the exit, something in the mirror caught my attention again. The sedan was changing, its shape becoming fluid and indistinct, as if it were made of smoke or shadow rather than metal and glass. The headlights stretched and distorted, becoming more like glowing eyes, and the grille seemed to split open like a mouth filled with chrome teeth. The driver was still visible through the windshield, but now it appeared to be laughing, its head thrown back in silent mirth that somehow conveyed more menace than any scream. I pressed harder on the accelerator, my Peterbilt's engine responding with a deeper growl, but the sedan kept pace effortlessly. The truck stop's lights were visible ahead, a welcome beacon of normalcy in this nightmare. But I realized with growing dread that the thing behind me wasn't going to be deterred by bright lights or other people. As I turned into the truck stop, I glanced once more at the rearview mirror, and what I saw there nearly caused me to lose control of my rig. The sedan was gone, but in its place was my own truck, an exact duplicate of my Peterbilt, and sitting behind the wheel was another version of myself. But this other Jake was grinning with those same sharp, numerous teeth, and his eyes had that same terrible phosphorescent glow. I slammed on the brakes and came to a stop in the parking lot with a hiss of air brakes and the smell of hot rubber. My hands were shaking as I reached up to look in the mirror again, but now it showed only the normal view of empty asphalt behind me, glistening with rain under the truck stop's sodium lights. I sat there for a long moment, trying to steady my breathing and convince myself that fatigue and the hypnotic effect of the rain had created some kind of hallucination. But when I finally worked up the courage to step out of my cab and walk around to check the back of my truck, I found fresh scratches in the paint near the doors, scratches that spelled out a single word in jagged letters: soon. I never did figure out what caused my rearview mirror to show me those impossible things that night, and I've never experienced anything quite like it since. But sometimes when I'm driving alone through the rain on dark highways, I catch myself avoiding the mirror altogether, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead, because deep down I know that somewhere out there, another version of myself is still following, waiting for the right moment to catch up. And lately, I've noticed that other drivers have been giving me strange looks at truck stops, as if they've seen something that disturbs them. The Prophecy Road, from Marcus Reed. The fog rolled in like a living thing that October night, thick and silver white under my headlights, as I guided my Peterbilt down Interstate 84 through eastern Oregon. I'd been running this route for 12 years, hauling electronics from Portland to Denver, and I knew these mountain passes like the lines on my weathered hands. The diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby beneath me, a comforting rhythm that had carried me through countless nights on the road. But this fog was different somehow, heavier than usual, seeming to press against the windshield with an almost deliberate weight. My CB crackled with scattered chatter from other drivers, their voices fading in and out like distant radio stations. Visibility down to maybe 20 feet on the westbound, came a gravelly voice. This stuff came out of nowhere. I adjusted my speed, letting the engine brake do most of the work as the grade steepened. The yellow fog line was barely visible, a ghostly ribbon that seemed to dance and weave in the ethereal mist. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but the ceramic mug still radiated a faint warmth against my palm as I lifted it to my lips. The radio weather report had mentioned possible fog in the valleys, but nothing like this. It wasn't just thick. It had an odd luminescence to it, as if lit from within by some invisible source. When I'd first encountered it near mile marker 247, I'd assumed it was just the way my headlights were hitting it. But now, 20 miles deeper into the stuff, I was beginning to wonder. The fog seemed to swirl with purpose, creating shapes and patterns that lasted just long enough to register in my peripheral vision before dissolving back into the uniform gray-white mass. I downshifted as the grade increased, the Jake brake chattering its metallic song. That's when I first noticed something peculiar. Through the fog, off to my right, I caught a glimpse of what looked like brake lights, 2 red dots glowing in the distance. Nothing unusual about that, except for the fact that there was no road there. I knew this stretch well enough to know that the shoulder dropped off into a steep ravine, filled with Douglas fir and scrub pine. No road, no pull-off, nothing but wilderness for miles. I slowed further, peering through the passenger window, but the lights were gone. Just the endless wall of fog, occasionally parted by my headlight beams like curtains being drawn aside for brief moments. The CB had gone quiet except for the occasional burst of static. I tried raising another driver, keying the mic and calling out, "Breaker 19, anybody got their ears on out here?" Nothing came back but the hollow whisper of empty airwaves. The fog began to thin slightly as I crested a small hill. And that's when I saw them again, those same red lights. But this time they were ahead of me, maybe a quarter mile down the road. As I got closer, I could make out the silhouette of another 18-wheeler. Hazard lights blinking, pulled over on the shoulder. I eased my rig behind it, air brakes hissing as I came to a stop. The other truck looked like a late-model Kenworth, dark blue or maybe black. It was hard to tell in the fog and the amber glow of our combined hazard lights. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. The fog seemed to muffle everything, my footsteps, the idle of my engine, even my own breathing. As I approached the other truck, I called out, "Hey there, you okay?" No answer. The closer I got, the more details I could make out. The trailer was unmarked, clean white with no company logos or dot numbers visible. The cab was spotless, like it had just rolled off the lot. When I reached the driver's door, I knocked on the window. "Everything all right in there?" The glass was tinted dark, and with the fog swirling around my flashlight beam, I couldn't see inside. I tried the handle, but it was locked. Walking around to the passenger side, I noticed something that made me pause. The license plate was blank. Not missing, not obscured, but actually blank, as if it had never been printed on. I was about to head back to my truck and radio for help when I heard the low rumble of a diesel engine starting up. The Kenworth's lights came on, cutting through the fog like golden swords. I stepped back as it began to pull away from the shoulder. slowly at first, then picking up speed as it merged back onto the highway. I watched its taillights disappear into the fog ahead, those twin red dots fading like dying stars. Climbing back into my cab, I sat for a moment trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. Maybe the driver had been sleeping and I'd woken him up. Maybe he'd solved whatever problem had caused him to pull over. I put my truck in gear and followed, maintaining a safe distance as we both continued through the mountain pass. The fog was beginning to clear in patches now, revealing glimpses of the familiar landscape, the steep rocky cuts, the guardrails, the reflective mile markers. That's when I began to notice something impossible. Every few miles I would catch sight of that same Kenworth through the thinning fog, but it wasn't ahead of me anymore. It was beside the road, sometimes on the shoulder, sometimes appearing to be on side roads that I knew didn't exist. Each time I saw it, it was in a different position, as if it were somehow moving parallel to my route but not on the highway itself. The fog would swirl and thicken for a moment, and when it cleared, the truck would be gone again. I tried to convince myself it was just the fog playing tricks with perspective. But deep down I knew what I was seeing defied explanation. The truck wasn't following the laws of physics or geography. It was appearing and disappearing like a ghost, always just at the edge of visibility, always maintaining that same steady pace that matched my own speed exactly. As I rounded a familiar curve near mile marker 223, the fog began to lift more substantially, and I found myself looking down into the valley below. The sight that met my eyes made me pull over immediately, hands shaking as I set the parking brake. Down in the valley, clearly visible through gaps in the dissipating fog, was a massive accident scene. Emergency lights flashed red and blue against the rocky walls of the canyon. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars surrounded what looked like an overturned tractor trailer. Even from this distance, I could make out enough details to feel my stomach clench with recognition. The overturned truck was a Peterbilt, the same model and color as my own. The trailer was jackknifed across both lanes of the valley highway, blocking traffic in both directions. Emergency personnel were working around the wreckage, their movements urgent and coordinated in the way that suggested this was a recent accident, maybe still in progress. I reached for my CB radio to report what I was seeing, but before I could key the mic, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. On the opposite hillside, clearly silhouetted against the night sky, sat that mysterious Kenworth I'd been following. It was parked at an angle that gave it a perfect view of the accident scene below, its headlights dark, just sitting there like a spectator at some macabre theater performance. The fog continued to clear, and as it did, more details of the accident became visible. I could see that the Peterbilt had gone off the road at a sharp curve, the same curve I would be navigating myself in about 15 minutes if I continued on my current route. The guardrail was twisted and broken where the truck had smashed through it. Recovery crews were already on scene with heavy equipment, working to clear the wreckage. I grabbed my logbook and checked the date, the time, my location. Everything was exactly as it should be. October 23rd, 2:47 a.m., mile marker 223. But what I was looking at in the valley below was happening on the very road I was supposed to take, at what would be approximately 3:15 a.m. if I maintained my current schedule. The accident I was witnessing hadn't happened yet. It was going to happen in less than 30 minutes. My hands trembled as I reached for the CB radio. I tried multiple channels, calling out to any driver who might be listening, trying to warn them about the curve ahead, about the fog, about the accident that was somehow already in progress below me. But every channel returned nothing but static, as if the radio waves themselves were being absorbed by the lingering wisps of fog. Looking back toward the mysterious Kenworth, I saw its headlights flicker on. It began to move, backing away from its observation point and disappearing behind the ridge. A moment later, I heard the distant sound of a diesel engine, growing louder as it approached my position from behind. In my side mirror, I watched as the Kenworth emerged from the fog and pulled alongside my truck on the highway. The Cargo That Remembers Thunder, from Marcus Delacroix. The smell hit me the moment I backed up to the loading dock in Shreveport. A scent so clean and electric it made my sinuses tingle like the air before a summer storm. I'd been hauling freight for 32 years, moving everything from furniture to industrial chemicals across the southeastern states, but I'd never encountered cargo that smelled like rain. The dispatcher had been vague about the load, just coordinates for pickup and delivery, standard paperwork, and a rush order that paid double my usual rate. In this business, you learn not to ask too many questions when the money's right. The warehouse sat on the outskirts of town, one of those prefab metal buildings that could house anything from auto parts to medical supplies. The loading crew worked in unusual silence, their movements efficient but somehow reluctant, as if they were eager to get the job done and get away. They wheeled out 12 identical crates, each about the size of a coffin, made from some kind of pale wood I didn't recognize. The grain ran in peculiar spirals, and the surface had an almost pearlescent sheen under the loading dock's fluorescent lights. As each crate slid into my trailer, that petrichor scent grew stronger, so intense I could taste it on my tongue. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was wrong somehow, like smelling ocean salt in the middle of Kansas or catching the scent of roses in a snowstorm. One of the crew members, a thin man with nervous hands, caught me sniffing the air and shook his head slowly. "Don't think too hard about it, driver," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some things are better left alone." Before I could ask what he meant, he disappeared back into the warehouse. The manifest listed the cargo as atmospheric research equipment, bound for a facility outside Natchez, Mississippi, about a 4-hour drive through bayou country and back roads I knew well enough to navigate in my sleep. The route would take me through some of the most isolated stretches of Louisiana, past cypress swamps and forgotten towns where the Spanish moss hung so thick it blocked out the stars. I'd driven those roads countless times, but something about this particular journey felt different from the moment I pulled away from the dock. The rain started about an hour into the drive, a light drizzle that seemed to appear from nowhere despite the clear weather forecast I'd checked before leaving. My 2018 Kenworth T680 handled the slick roads with its usual reliability, the diesel engine humming its familiar rhythm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The rain had no pattern, no direction, as if it were falling upward just as much as down. In my mirrors, I watched droplets streak across the trailer in impossible spirals, defying physics in ways that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. The smell from the cargo had begun to permeate the entire cab despite the sealed trailer, growing stronger with each passing mile. It wasn't just the scent of rain anymore, but something deeper and more complex, like the air during a thunderstorm mixed with ozone and something organic, almost floral. I tried adjusting the air conditioning, switching to recirculated air, but nothing helped. The aroma seemed to seep through the very metal of the truck, as if it were emanating from the cargo itself rather than simply being carried by air currents. By the time I reached the deep bayou country, the rain had intensified into something that bordered on supernatural. Each droplet that struck my windshield seemed to linger longer than it should, spreading into intricate patterns before my wipers swept them away. The usual sounds of my truck, the steady rumble of the engine and the whisper of tires on wet asphalt, had taken on an odd quality, as if they were being filtered through water. Even my CB radio produced nothing but a soft static that sounded almost like distant rainfall. No matter how I adjusted the frequency, I pulled into a truck stop near Baton Rouge to grab coffee and check my load, more out of curiosity than concern. The parking lot was nearly empty, just my rig and a couple of other trucks whose drivers were probably sleeping in their cabs. The fluorescent lights in the store flickered erratically, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, kept glancing toward my truck through the rain-streaked windows, her expression growing more troubled each time. When I walked back to check the trailer, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The rain wasn't just falling on my truck, it was falling from it. Drops of water seemed to be emerging from the trailer itself, rising up from the roof and sides before falling back down in a continuous cycle. The metal that should have been cold to the touch was warm, almost feverish, and when I pressed my ear against the side, I could swear I heard something like breathing from within the cargo hold. The drive through the Mississippi Delta became increasingly surreal as the night wore on. The rain had taken on an luminescent quality, each drop glowing faintly blue-green in my headlights like tiny falling stars. The radio static had evolved into something that almost resembled voices, whispers in a language I didn't recognize but that somehow filled me with a profound sense of longing and loss. Trees along the roadside bent toward my truck as I passed, their Spanish moss reaching like grasping fingers, and I began to see shapes moving in the water-filled ditches, forms that vanished whenever I tried to look directly at them. The GPS led me deeper into territory I'd never traveled before, down increasingly narrow roads that seemed to exist in a perpetual state of twilight despite my headlights. The landscape had become impossibly lush, with vegetation that shouldn't have been able to grow in this climate reaching across the road to form a living tunnel. The air itself felt thick and electric, charged with the kind of energy that makes your hair stand on end and fills your mouth with the taste of copper pennies. It was then that I realized the cargo was changing. Through the connecting window between cab and trailer, I could see a soft, pulsing glow emanating from the crates. The glow had the same blue-green quality as the luminescent rain, and it seemed to pulse in rhythm with something, though whether it was my heartbeat or some external force, I couldn't determine. The smell had evolved too, becoming so intense it was almost solid, a presence in the cab that seemed to have weight and substance. The final stretch of road to the delivery location wound through a cypress swamp that seemed to exist outside of normal time and space. The trees were impossibly tall, their canopy lost in a perpetual mist that glowed with its own internal light. The rain had stopped falling from the sky but continued to rise from my trailer, creating vertical streams of luminescent water that defied gravity. My truck's engine began to make sounds I'd never heard before, a harmonic humming that resonated with the glowing cargo behind me. As I approached what GPS indicated was my destination, I realized there was no facility, no building of any kind, just a clearing in the swamp where the road ended at the edge of dark water that stretched to the horizon. Standing at the water's edge were figures in rain slickers, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods, waiting with the patient stillness of people who had been expecting me for a very long time. I climbed down from the cab on shaking legs, my boots squelching in mud that felt too warm and too thick. The figures moved to unload the crates with the same silent efficiency I'd witnessed at the pickup. But now I could see that their movements weren't quite human, too fluid and coordinated, like a choreographed dance. As each crate was removed from my trailer and carried into the swamp, the rain that had been rising from my truck began to dissipate, though the electric smell lingered. The last figure to approach me held out a clipboard with paperwork I signed, despite not being able to read the symbols that had replaced normal letters and numbers. When our hands brushed during the exchange, I felt a shock of cold that went straight to my bones, and for just a moment, I saw beneath the hood to glimpse something that wasn't entirely a face, something that shifted like water and reflected light that came from no visible source. I drove away from that place as fast as safety would allow, my trailer empty but somehow feeling heavier than when it had been loaded. The return journey passed in a blur of ordinary rain and normal darkness, as if the world had reset itself to familiar parameters. By the time I reached civilization, the sun was rising, and I could almost convince myself that the entire experience had been some kind of exhaustion-induced hallucination. But even now, weeks later, every time it rains, I catch that electric scent in the air and remember the cargo that smelled like thunder. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving empty roads, I see those same luminescent droplets in my peripheral vision, rising instead of falling. And I wonder what exactly I delivered to that place beyond the cypress trees, and whether some loads are meant to carry more than just cargo from one place to another, but memories and dreams. The Emerald Mile. From Jake Morrison. The fuel gauge needle danced just above empty when I spotted the neon sign cutting through the thick Montana fog like a lighthouse beacon. Green letters spelled out Desert Rose Truck Stop in flickering cursive, though we were nowhere near any desert I knew of. My Peterbilt 379 had been drinking diesel like a man dying of thirst for the past 100 miles. And the nearest town, according to my GPS, was still 40 minutes down this lonely stretch of Highway 2. Sometimes you take what Providence offers, even when it doesn't quite make sense. The gravel crunched under my 18 wheels as I pulled into the lot, my headlight sweeping across a collection of rigs that looked like they'd been there since the Carter administration. Chrome dulled by years of road grime, paint faded to ghosts of their original colors, and not a single running light blinking among them. The place had that after-midnight stillness that every trucker knows, when the world feels suspended between one day and the next, but something about this particular quiet made my skin crawl. I set the air brakes with a satisfying hiss and climbed down from the cab, my boots finding puddles I hadn't seen in the darkness. The air tasted metallic, like pennies left too long in the rain, and carried the usual truck stop cocktail of diesel fumes and rubber. But underneath it all was something else. Something organic and wrong, like vegetables left to rot in a sealed container. The fuel pump stood in a neat row under harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered with the persistence of dying insects, casting everything in alternating shadows and sickly white glare. The attendant emerged from a building that looked more like a converted house than a proper truck stop office, shuffling across the wet asphalt in coveralls that might have been blue once upon a time. He was thin in the way that comes from years of coffee and cigarettes instead of proper meals, with fingers stained dark from decades of handling fuel lines and motor oil. His smile was too wide and too eager for 3 a.m, showing teeth that caught the neon light in unpleasant ways. "Evening, driver," he called out, his voice carrying that particular rural cadence that turns every statement into something that might be a question. "Looking for diesel tonight, I'd imagine. Got just the thing for a fine rig like that Peterbilt of yours." He gestured toward my truck with genuine appreciation, but his eyes held something else entirely. Something that reminded me of the way a cat watches a mouse that doesn't yet know it's been spotted. I nodded and pulled out my fuel card, eager to get this transaction finished and get back on the road. There was something about this place that made me want to keep moving, to put miles between myself and whatever wrongness hung in the air like invisible fog. But the attendant waved away my card with a dismissive flutter of his stained fingers. "No need for plastic tonight, friend. Got a special running on our premium blend. Fill her up for just 50 cash, and I guarantee you'll get better mileage than you've ever seen." He was already moving toward the pumps, selecting a nozzle attached to a hose that seemed newer than anything else in the place. "This here's our own special mixture. Local refinery started making it just last month. Burns cleaner than anything the big companies are pushing these days. $50 to fill a 300-gallon tank was impossible, even with diesel prices at their lowest. But I was tired and running on fumes both literally and figuratively. Sometimes when you're staring at the prospect of being stranded on a dark highway with nothing but hope and hazard lights, you don't ask too many questions about good fortune. I handed him the crumpled bills from my wallet and watched as he began pumping fuel into my tanks. The diesel that flowed through the clear section of the hose wasn't the familiar amber or pale yellow I'd expected. Instead, it moved like liquid emerald, translucent and somehow luminous, as if it carried its own internal light source. The color was mesmerizing, shifting between deep forest green and brilliant jade as it caught the overhead lights, flowing with a viscosity that seemed almost too thick for proper fuel, but somehow too thin for anything else. "That's quite a color," I said, trying to keep my voice casual while my gut twisted with growing unease. Never seen diesel look quite like that before. "What exactly makes it green?" The attendant's grin widened until it seemed to stretch beyond the normal boundaries of human anatomy. "Proprietary blend," he said, the words coming out in a sing-song rhythm that made them sound rehearsed. "Little bit of this, little bit of that. Some things are better left mysterious, don't you think? Besides, it's not the color that matters, it's the performance. You'll see what I mean once you get back on the road. The pump clicked off with a finality that seemed to echo longer than it should have, and I found myself staring at the fuel gauge in disbelief. The needle hadn't just moved to full. It had somehow traveled beyond the maximum marking, quivering in space that shouldn't have existed on the gauge face. The attendant was already coiling the hose with practiced efficiency, humming something under his breath that might have been a tune if the notes hadn't been so discordant and strange. I signed the receipt with hands that had developed a slight tremor, though I told myself it was just the cold mountain air working its way through my jacket. The paper felt odd beneath my fingers, smooth in a way that paper shouldn't be, and the ink from the pen seemed to sink into it rather than sitting on the surface. When I looked back at my signature, the letters appeared to shimmer slightly, as if they were still wet despite having dried the moment they touched the page. "Drive safe now," the attendant called as I climbed back into my cab, his voice following me through the closed windows with impossible clarity. "That fuel of ours, it likes to burn hot and fast. You might find yourself making better time than usual tonight." The engine turned over on the first try, which should have been reassuring, but instead, the immediate response felt wrong somehow. My Caterpillar motor had always been reliable but never eager, requiring a moment or two of coaxing before settling into its familiar rhythm. Tonight it roared to life with an enthusiasm that bordered on hunger, the RPMs climbing higher than they should have at idle, the whole truck vibrating with barely contained energy. I eased out of the parking lot and back onto Highway 2, glancing in my mirrors as the Desert Rose truck stop faded into the fog behind me. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw the attendant still standing motionless beside the pumps, his pale face turned in my direction, but when I looked again there was nothing but darkness and the fading glow of that impossible neon sign. The truck was performing exactly as advertised, eating up miles with a smoothness I'd never experienced in 15 years of long-haul driving. The engine purred with contentment, the transmission shifted at perfect intervals, and my fuel gauge held steady at that impossible position beyond full. But with each mile that passed beneath my wheels, the landscape outside began to take on qualities that defied explanation. The trees lining the highway seemed taller than they had been an hour ago, their branches reaching across the asphalt like gnarled fingers trying to weave a canopy over the road. The fog had thickened until my headlights could barely penetrate 20 feet ahead, but somehow I could see perfectly, as if the green fuel burning in my engine was providing more than just power. Everything was tinted with that same emerald hue. The world transformed into an underwater dreamscape, where physics worked differently and familiar things took on alien geometries. My radio had been picking up nothing but static since leaving the truck stop, but now voices began to emerge from the white noise. They spoke in languages I didn't recognize, using words that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and drill directly into my brain. The conversations were urgent, desperate, as if the speakers were trying to warn me of something terrible that was approaching too quickly to avoid. The speedometer showed I was traveling at a steady 65 miles per hour, but the mile markers were flashing past at intervals that suggested I was covering ground at twice that speed. The fuel gauge hadn't moved from its impossible position, and the engine temperature remained perfectly cool despite the supernatural performance. I tried to slow down to bring the truck back to normal speeds, but the gas pedal seemed disconnected from the engine's behavior, responding to some other force entirely. Then I saw the lights in my mirrors, green and pulsing like a heartbeat made visible. At first I thought it might be another truck, but as they grew closer I realized they were moving with the fluid grace of something that had never been mechanical. They danced from side to side across the highway, sometimes separating into multiple points of light, sometimes converging into a single blazing orb that hurt to look at directly. The radio voices were becoming more frantic, overlapping each other in a cacophony of warnings I couldn't understand but felt in my bones. The Meridian Loop, from Jake Sullivan. The thing about driving long haul is that you learn to trust your instruments more than your eyes. especially when the fatigue starts playing tricks on your mind. My Peterbilt's GPS had never steered me wrong in 8 years of cross-country runs, so when it directed me to take exit 247 off Interstate 80 somewhere in the Nevada desert, I didn't question it. The afternoon sun was sitting high and merciless in that pale blue sky, the kind of heat that makes asphalt shimmer like water and turns your cab into a rolling oven, despite the air conditioning working overtime. I was hauling a load of electronics from Sacramento to Denver. Nothing unusual, just another routine run through the endless stretch of sagebrush and alkali dust that defines this part of the world. The radio had been crackling with static for the past hour, picking up nothing but fragments of distant conversations and the occasional burst of Mexican polka music from stations hundreds of miles away. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, but I had learned long ago that in this desolate country, you take fuel when you can find it, not when you need it. Exit 247 curved away from the interstate in a gentle arc, leading to what my GPS cheerfully announced as a truck stop and fuel plaza. The off-ramp felt familiar under my wheels. That same worn concrete texture you find on every highway exit across America. But something about it nagged at me as I downshifted and felt the Jake brake engage with its characteristic rumble. The landscape around me was nothing but rolling hills of scrub brush and scattered Joshua trees, their twisted arms reaching toward the sun like desperate prayers. The fuel plaza materialized ahead exactly as expected, a standard setup with diesel pumps arranged in neat rows and a convenience store squatting beneath a sun-faded canopy. A handful of other trucks were scattered across the lot, their chrome bumpers throwing back painful flashes of sunlight. I pulled up to pump number 7, the diesel handle hanging there like it was waiting specifically for me, and killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound after hours of the constant rumble of 18 wheels on asphalt, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the distant whisper of wind through the desert scrub. Fueling took the usual 20 minutes, enough time to check my logbook, stretch my legs, and grab a coffee and a sandwich from inside the store. The clerk was a thin man with sun-weathered skin and the kind of 1,000-yard stare you develop after spending too many years watching an empty horizon. He rang up my purchases without comment, his movements mechanical and practiced. Outside, the heat was building toward its afternoon peak, that crushing weight that makes you grateful for air conditioning and provides excellent motivation to keep moving. Getting back on the interstate should have been simple. The GPS directed me back to the on-ramp, and I followed its instructions without thinking, the way you do when you've made this same maneuver thousands of times before. But as I accelerated up the ramp and merged back into traffic, something felt wrong. The angle of the sun hadn't changed, still blazing down from that same position in the western sky, and the landscape looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. I chalked it up to the monotony of desert driving, where 1 mile looks much like the next and time seems to stretch like taffy in the heat. 47 miles later, my GPS announced that I should take exit 247 for fuel and services. I glanced at the fuel gauge, still reading 3/4 full, and frowned. The exit number was identical. The distance from the previous fuel stop was exactly what I expected, but something cold was forming in my stomach despite the heat. As I crested the small rise before the exit, the same truck stop came into view, identical down to the arrangement of vehicles in the parking lot. The same truck sat in the same positions, chrome gleaming in what should have been a later afternoon sun but looked exactly the same as before. I pulled into the same parking space at pump number 7, my hands operating the controls automatically while my mind tried to process what I was seeing. The fuel gauge still read 3/4 full, but I went through the motions anyway, watching the numbers spin on the pump display while that cold feeling in my stomach spread upward toward my chest. The clerk inside the convenience store was the same thin man with the same weathered face, and he rang up the same coffee and sandwich with the same mechanical precision, his eyes holding that same empty stare. Back in the cab, I checked my watch, my logbook, even the truck's digital clock, but they all told the same story. According to every timepiece I carried, barely 2 hours had passed since I'd first taken this exit. but I'd definitely driven the prescribed distance between fuel stops. The sun hung in exactly the same position, casting shadows at precisely the same angles, as if time itself had decided to pause and wait for me to figure out what was happening. The third time I took exit 247, a different kind of awareness began to creep through me. This wasn't fatigue or highway hypnosis or any of the usual tricks that the road plays on drivers who spend too many hours behind the wheel. This was something else entirely. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up despite the sweat rolling down my spine. I began to pay attention to details I'd missed before. The way the other trucks never seemed to have drivers visible in their cabs. The way the wind always blew from the same direction at the same speed. The way that sun never moved even a degree from its position in the sky. During the fourth loop, I tried breaking the pattern. Instead of fueling up, I parked at the far end of the lot and walked around the entire facility looking for something, anything that might explain what was happening to me. The building was solid enough, casting a real shadow, and the heat radiating from the asphalt felt genuine against my skin. Other trucks came and went, or seemed to, but when I tried to catch sight of their drivers, something always interfered. A reflection off a windshield would blind me at the crucial moment, or I'd be distracted by a sound that turned out to be nothing when I looked toward it. The fifth loop brought a growing sense of panic that I fought to keep under control. Professional drivers learn to manage fear the way we manage fuel consumption and driving hours, as a resource that has to be carefully rationed. But this was different from anything I'd experienced in 20 years of over-the-road driving. This was the kind of fear that comes from realizing that all the rules you've learned to live by might not apply anymore, that the solid, predictable world you've built your life around might be nothing more than a thin shell over something vast and incomprehensible. By the seventh loop, I was convinced that I was trapped, caught in some kind of temporal snare that I couldn't begin to understand. The sun never moved, the shadows never shifted, and that same hot wind kept blowing across the desert from the same direction, with the same intensity. I tried different approaches, different routes through the truck stop, even attempted to drive past the exit entirely, but somehow I always ended up taking that same off-ramp. Always found myself at pump number 7, always faced the same thin clerk with his empty, weathered stare. It was during the 9th loop that I noticed the gradual change beginning to creep into the edges of the scene. The colors seemed slightly more saturated, the shadows a little deeper, the quality of light subtly different in ways that I couldn't quite articulate. The other trucks in the lot were positioned exactly the same as always, but now they looked somehow more real, more present, as if they were slowly solidifying from some half-formed state into full reality. The feeling was like watching a photograph develop in slow motion, details becoming clearer and more defined with each repetition. The clerk's eyes were different too, no longer empty but filled with a kind of ancient patience, as if he'd been waiting for me to notice him, really notice him, for a very long time. When our gazes met across the counter during that 9th transaction, he smiled, and I felt something fundamental shift in the world around me. The smile wasn't hostile or predatory, just knowing. The expression of someone who has watched the same scene play out many times before and understands its ultimate purpose better than the actors involved. On the 10th loop, I made a decision that felt simultaneously crazy and completely logical. Instead of going through the familiar motions of fueling and purchasing refreshments, I walked directly to the clerk and asked him a simple question. How long had I been coming here? His smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white and too perfect for his weathered face, and he told me that time worked differently in places like this, that some roads existed outside the normal flow of hours and days, and that I'd been chosen to experience one of them. The explanation should have terrified me, but instead I felt a strange sense of relief. There was an answer, even if it wasn't one that made sense according to everything I thought I knew about the world. The clerk explained that the loop would end when I was ready for it to end, when I'd learned whatever lesson this place was trying to teach me, but he couldn't tell me what that lesson was. The Chimes at Midnight, from Marcus Riley. The digital clock on my Kenworth's dashboard read 11:47 p.m. when I first spotted the bell tower rising against the star-drunk sky, its Gothic silhouette cutting through the darkness like a prayer made of stone and shadow. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, hauling a load of farm equipment from Des Moines to Phoenix, and my eyes felt like they'd been rolled in sand. The truck stop I'd been counting on for the last 100 miles had turned out to be permanently closed, its windows boarded up and weeds growing through cracks in the asphalt. But here, just off Highway 83 in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, sat what looked like salvation, a well-lit parking lot beside an old church, spacious enough for my rig and apparently open to travelers. The parking lot stretched out beneath pale sodium lights that cast everything in shades of amber and cream, creating pools of warmth against the cool October night. My truck's engine settled into its familiar idle rumble as I guided the 18-wheeler toward the far end of the lot, away from the handful of cars clustered near the church entrance. The building itself was something out of a different century, all weathered limestone and arched windows that seemed to watch my approach with dark, glassy eyes. The bell tower dominated the structure, rising at least 60 feet into the night sky, its four-sided peak crowned with a simple wooden cross that caught the parking lot lights and held them like a beacon. I set the air brakes with their characteristic hiss and killed the engine, letting the sudden silence wash over me like cool water. Through my windshield, I could see that the church appeared to be hosting some kind of evening service or gathering. Warm yellow light spilled from the stained glass windows, painting abstract patterns of color across the nearby asphalt, and I could make out the shadows of people moving inside. The sight brought an unexpected comfort to my road-weary soul. There's something reassuring about finding life and light in these forgotten corners of America. These small towns that the interstate system left behind like islands in an ocean of farmland and sky. I was reaching for my logbook when the first chime reached my ears, floating down from the bell tower above like a drop of liquid bronze. It was followed by 11 more, each note hanging in the still air for what seemed like forever before fading into the whisper of wind through wheat fields. Midnight. The sound was beautiful in a way that made my chest tight, resonating not just through the air but seeming to vibrate through the very bones of my truck, through the seat beneath me, through my own rib cage until I felt like a tuning fork struck by an invisible hand. I'd planned to grab a few hours of sleep in my sleeper berth, but something about those bell chimes had left me restless and alert. Instead, I climbed down from the cab and stretched my legs, breathing in the crisp autumn air that carried scents of dying leaves and distant wood smoke. The parking lot felt different now that I was walking across it, larger somehow, as if the space between the yellow lines had expanded when I wasn't looking. My footsteps echoed strangely, each bootfall seeming to bounce back from multiple directions at once. The church service appeared to be ending. I could hear the muffled sound of voices inside, the scrape of chairs being pushed back, the general rustling that accompanies a congregation preparing to depart. I found myself walking toward the building, drawn by curiosity and perhaps by a loneliness I hadn't fully acknowledged after so many hours alone on the road. The main entrance was a set of heavy wooden doors topped by an elaborate stone arch, and as I approached, I could hear fragments of conversation from within, but the voices sounded wrong somehow, though I couldn't immediately identify why. They had the rhythm and cadence of normal speech, but there was something underneath it all, a strange uniformity that made the hair on my arms stand up beneath my flannel shirt. It was like listening to a chorus that was trying very hard to sound like individual voices, but couldn't quite manage it. The effect was subtle but deeply unsettling, like a song played slightly off-key. I was still trying to puzzle out what I was hearing when the church doors opened and the congregation began to emerge. The first person through the doorway was an elderly woman in a dark coat, her silver hair gleaming under the parking lot lights. She smiled at me as she passed, a perfectly normal, friendly expression that should have put me at ease. Instead, something about that smile made my stomach clench with unnamed dread. Her eyes, I realized, never quite seemed to focus on me, as if she were looking at something standing just behind my left shoulder. More people followed, all of them offering those same pleasant, unfocused smiles as they walked past me toward their cars. Men in worn suits, women in simple dresses, even a few children holding their parents' hands. They looked like any small-town congregation heading home after Wednesday night service. But that wrongness I'd heard in their voices was even more pronounced in their movements. They walked with identical rhythm, their footsteps creating a soft percussion against the asphalt that was almost musical in its precision. I tried to return their greetings, nodding and murmuring hellos, but my voice seemed to stick in my throat like it had forgotten how to work. The air around me felt thick suddenly, charged with the kind of electric tension that precedes a thunderstorm. Even though the night sky remained clear and star-scattered, I found myself looking up nervously, half expecting to see clouds gathering around the bell tower's peak. The last person to emerge from the church was a tall man in a black coat who I took to be the minister. Unlike the others, his gaze found mine immediately, and held it with an intensity that made me want to step backward. His smile was wider than the others had been, revealing teeth that seemed too white in the sodium light, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the distance between us. "Welcome, traveler," he said, though he hadn't moved any closer. "You've arrived at a most fortuitous time. The bells have just finished their midnight song, and the evening's prayers have been answered. Will you be staying long?" There was something about the way he phrased the question that made it sound less like polite inquiry and more like a test, as if my answer would determine something important. I found my voice at last, though it came out rougher than I'd intended. "Just until morning," I called back. "I hope it's all right that I parked out here. I can move my truck if it's a problem." His smile grew even wider. "Oh, no problem at all. The lot welcomes all kinds of vehicles. We've had quite a few interesting arrivals over the years. Rest well, driver. The bells will sing again when it's time." With that cryptic comment, he turned and walked away, his footsteps joining the rhythmic percussion of the others until they all disappeared into the darkness beyond the parking lot's edge. I noticed that despite the number of people I'd seen leaving the church, only 3 cars departed, their headlights sweeping across the lot before vanishing down the county road. I stood alone in the amber-tinted silence, feeling more isolated than I had during the entire 14-hour drive. The church building loomed beside me, its windows now dark, the bell tower rising into the night like a finger pointing accusations at the stars. Every instinct I'd developed in 20 years of long-haul trucking was telling me to get back in my cab, fire up the engine, and put as many miles as possible between myself and this place. But exhaustion was winning the battle against unease, and I found myself walking back toward my truck with leaden steps. I was almost to the cab when I heard it, a soft metallic creaking from somewhere above, like the sound of old hinges working against rust and gravity. Looking up, I could see that the bell tower had louvers on all 4 sides, wooden slats that would normally allow the sound of the bells to carry across the surrounding countryside. But what I was hearing wasn't the bronze voice of church bells. It was something else entirely, a rhythmic squeaking that almost sounded like footsteps on wooden stairs. The sound was climbing, growing closer to the top of the tower with each measured creak. I found myself counting the sounds, trying to estimate how many steps might be in a 60-foot bell tower, when the noise stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heart hammering against my ribs and the distant whisper of wind through wheat. Then the bells began to ring again. But it wasn't midnight anymore, and these weren't the measured chimes I'd heard before. The sound that poured down from the tower was wild and arrhythmic, as if something was throwing itself against the bronze bells in a frenzy of motion. The cacophony filled the parking lot, bouncing off the asphalt in my truck's trailer until I felt like I was standing inside a giant's percussion instrument. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the sound seemed to bypass them entirely. resonating through my bones and teeth until my entire skeleton felt like it was vibrating in harmony. The Fever Freight. From Marcus Holloway. The thing about driving long haul is that you get to know your truck like you know your own heartbeat. Every vibration and whistle, every grunt and sigh of the engine as it pulls through the dark hours between midnight and dawn. So when Big Betty started acting strange 3 states back, I knew something wasn't right. It wasn't anything I could pin down at first, just a feeling that settled in my gut like bad coffee. But by the time I was rolling through the empty stretches of Wyoming, with nothing but sagebrush and starlight for company, I knew my 18-wheeler had caught something that no mechanic in his right mind would understand. It started with the air conditioning, which should have been my first real clue. Betty's AC had been running ice cold for the better part of 2 years. Ever since I'd had the system overhauled in Tucson, but somewhere around mile marker 847, the air coming through the vents began to carry a different kind of chill. Not the clean, mechanical cold I was used to, but something wet and organic, like the breath from an open grave, or the exhalation from deep caves that never see sunlight. I adjusted the controls thinking maybe moisture had gotten into the system somehow, but the temperature gauge showed everything running normal, even though my breath was starting to fog in the cab and I could feel goosebumps rising along my arms despite the July heat outside. The engine temperature was the next thing to catch my attention, though it took me a while to realize what I was seeing. The needle on the gauge was sitting right where it always did, steady in the middle of the normal range, but something about it looked wrong. I kept glancing over at it as I drove, trying to figure out what was bothering me, until it hit me during a long, straight stretch with nothing but tumbleweeds and fence posts sliding by in the darkness. The gauge was reading normal, but the needle was trembling, just barely, like it was shivering. Such a small thing. So subtle I might have missed it if I hadn't been driving Betty for the past 4 years, but there it was. That tiny tremor that suggested something deep in her mechanical heart wasn't quite right. I pulled into a truck stop outside Laramie to take a look under the hood, figuring maybe there was a loose connection or a worn belt causing the irregularity. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a couple of other rigs and a sedan with out-of-state plates, their engines ticking quietly as they cooled in the mountain air. When I popped Betty's hood, the first thing that hit me was the smell. That same organic coldness I'd been breathing in the cab, but stronger now, concentrated around the engine block like invisible fog. The engine itself looked fine, all the belts and hoses in their proper places, but when I touched the radiator to check for heat, my hand jerked back instinctively. The metal was cold. Not just cool like you'd expect from an engine that had been running for hours, but genuinely cold, like it had been sitting in a freezer. I spent 20 minutes checking everything I could think of. The coolant levels and connections, the thermostat housing, even the temperature sensor, but everything appeared to be functioning exactly as it should. The engine oil was clean, the coolant was clear, and there were no signs of leaks or mechanical failure anywhere I looked. Yet when I climbed back into the cab and fired her up, that unnatural chill began flowing through the vents again within minutes, and I could swear the engine's rumble had developed a new quality, a kind of hollow resonance that reminded me of wind blowing through empty buildings. The road between Laramie and Cheyenne is mostly straight and empty in the dead of night, which gave me plenty of time to think about what was happening to my truck. I'd heard stories from other drivers over the years, tales told in dimly lit diners and truck stop parking lots about rigs that seemed to develop personalities of their own, vehicles that would refuse to start in certain locations, or would mysteriously break down to prevent their drivers from making dangerous runs. Most of it was just superstition, the kind of folklore that springs up around any profession that involves long hours alone with machinery. But as I felt that cold air continuing to flow around me, and watched the temperature needle maintain its barely perceptible tremor, I found myself wondering if there might be more truth to those stories than I'd ever wanted to believe. The CB radio had been quiet for most of the night, just the occasional burst of static or distant conversation too faint to make out clearly. But as I approached the Colorado border, I started picking up a stronger signal. At first it was just background chatter, other drivers talking about weather conditions and road construction. But then I heard something that made me turn up the volume and listen more carefully. A driver somewhere ahead of me was describing problems with his rig, temperature fluctuations and cooling system irregularities that sounded remarkably similar to what I was experiencing with Betty. I keyed the microphone and asked for his location, identifying myself and describing my own truck's symptoms. His response came back immediately, and there was something in his voice that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, despite the cold air flowing around me. He said he'd been dealing with the same issues for the past 2 days, ever since he'd stopped to help at an accident scene outside Salt Lake City. A car had gone off the road in a snowstorm, he explained, even though it was the middle of July, and by the time the emergency crews arrived, there was nothing left but twisted metal and a patch of ice that wouldn't melt, despite the summer heat. The connection started breaking up after that, his voice fading in and out through waves of static, but I caught enough fragments to piece together the rest of his story. Something about the cold that had surrounded that accident scene, the way it seemed to cling to everything it touched, seeping into metal and glass and following him down the highway like an invisible passenger. His final transmission was barely audible, just a few words about how his truck had started making sounds like breathing, deep mechanical inhalations and exhalations that didn't match the rhythm of the engine, before the signal disappeared entirely into white noise. I tried calling him back several times, but there was no response, and gradually even the static faded until the CB fell silent again. The silence felt heavier now, more oppressive, and I found myself glancing repeatedly at the mirrors to check the empty road behind me. The temperature in the cab had dropped several more degrees, cold enough now that my breath was forming visible clouds every time I exhaled, and frost was beginning to form around the edges of the windshield despite the warm summer air outside. That's when I noticed the sound the other driver had mentioned, that breathing quality to the engine's rhythm. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as imagination or the natural variation in diesel engine noise, but as I listened more carefully, I could hear it clearly. The normal rumble and vibration of the motor had developed an underlying pattern that rose and fell like respiration, slow and deep, and somehow organic. Each inhalation seemed to draw that unnatural cold deeper into the cab, while every exhalation sent tremors through the steering wheel and floor that felt disturbingly like a heartbeat. The highway ahead curved through a series of rolling hills dotted with scrub pine and rock outcroppings, and as I navigated the winding road, I began to see patches of what looked like snow or ice gleaming in my headlights. They appeared at irregular intervals along the shoulder and median, small areas where the asphalt seemed to be covered with a thin layer of frost that reflected the truck's lights like scattered diamonds. The outside temperature gauge still read 72 degrees, and there wasn't a cloud in the star-filled sky, but those frozen patches grew more frequent as I continued south, until stretches of the roadway itself began to glitter with ice. I was starting to seriously consider pulling over and calling for assistance when I saw the other truck. It was parked on the shoulder about a mile ahead, hazard lights blinking in the darkness, and as I got closer, I could see it was the same make and model as Betty, though painted in different colors. I slowed down and pulled in behind it, thinking maybe it was the driver I'd been talking to on the CB. But when I climbed down from my cab and approached the other vehicle, I realized immediately that something was very wrong. The entire truck was covered in a thick layer of ice, not just frost but actual ice several inches thick that had formed over every surface like a crystalline shell. The cab windows were completely opaque with frozen condensation, and icicles hung from the bumpers and exhaust pipes like frozen tears. The engine was still running. I could hear the diesel rumbling beneath all that ice. But there was no way anyone could be alive inside that frozen tomb. No way anyone could have survived the kind of cold that would be necessary to create such a phenomenon. I called out anyway, shouting to see if anyone would respond. But the only answer was the sound of my own voice echoing off the rock formations and the steady breathing rhythm of the frozen truck's engine. The living haul from Marcus the Heatwave had been merciless that summer, stretching across the interstate like a fever that wouldn't break. I'd been hauling refrigerated goods for nearly 15 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at a driver. But nothing had prepared me for what I discovered about that particular trailer during those sweltering August nights. The company had assigned me a different rig that week, an older Peterbilt with a refrigerated trailer that had just come out of maintenance, and from the moment I hooked up to it at the depot in Phoenix, something felt different about the whole setup. The paperwork seemed routine enough, frozen foods bound for a chain of grocery stores up in Oregon, but the dispatcher had given me an odd look when he handed over the manifest. He'd mentioned something about the trailer being serviced for temperature irregularities, how the previous driver had complained about the refrigeration unit acting up during hot weather, cycling on and off at strange intervals that didn't match the thermostat settings. I'd shrugged it off at first, figuring it was just another case of finicky equipment that needed a firm hand and regular monitoring. The kind of mechanical quirks that come with the territory when you're driving rigs that have logged hundreds of thousands of miles across America's highways. The first day of driving passed without incident, the trailer behaving normally as I made my way north through the desert landscapes of Arizona and into the cooler elevations of northern Nevada. The refrigeration unit hummed steadily behind me, maintaining the required temperature for the frozen cargo, and I settled into the familiar rhythm of long-distance hauling. But as evening approached and the outside temperature began to climb again, something unusual began to happen that made me question everything I thought I knew about mechanical systems and the nature of the cargo I was carrying. It started as a subtle change in the sound coming from the trailer, a shift in the steady drone of the cooling system that was barely perceptible over the rumble of the diesel engine. At first, I attributed it to the unit working harder to maintain temperature as the ambient heat increased. But as I listened more carefully through the open window, I realized the sound wasn't mechanical at all. It was rhythmic in a way that machinery never is, rising and falling with an organic cadence that reminded me uncomfortably of something breathing deeply and slowly, as if the entire trailer were some massive lung expanding and contracting with each passing mile. I pulled over at a truck stop near Winnemucca just after sunset, when the air was still radiating heat from the asphalt, and the temperature gauge on my dashboard was reading 98 degrees even with the sun gone down. Walking around to check the trailer had become routine for me over the years, inspecting the tires and ensuring the refrigeration unit was functioning properly. But as I approached the rear of the trailer that evening, the breathing sound became unmistakably clear. It wasn't the cycling of a cooling system or the settling of metal expanding in the heat. It was the deep, measured respiration of something alive, something enormous, something that filled the entire 40-foot space behind me. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation, perhaps a loose panel vibrating in the wind or an unusual harmonic created by the interaction between the cooling fans and the trailer's structure. I climbed up onto the rear bumper and pressed my ear against the aluminum walls, and what I heard nearly made me lose my balance and fall to the pavement below. The breathing was coming from inside the walls themselves, as if the metal skin of the trailer had somehow become a living membrane, expanding outward with each inhalation and contracting slightly with each exhalation, the entire structure pulsing like a heart in the Nevada heat. I checked the manifest again under the harsh fluorescent lights of the truck stop, reading through every line item of frozen goods, cases of ice cream and frozen vegetables and microwave dinners that should have been solid and lifeless in their sub-zero environment. But as I stood there in the parking lot, watching other drivers fuel their rigs and grab coffee from the convenience store, I could see my trailer moving slightly, the sides bulging outward by perhaps an inch before settling back to their normal position, then repeating the cycle with that same slow, biological rhythm that made my skin crawl with unease. Sleep that night was impossible in the truck stop's sleeper berth, not just because of the heat that seemed to radiate from the trailer even with the refrigeration unit running, but because the breathing had become louder and more pronounced as the night wore on. Every few minutes I could feel the entire truck rock slightly, as the trailer expanded and contracted, and through the thin walls of the sleeper compartment, I could hear what sounded almost like a heartbeat, a deep thrumming that seemed to emanate from the cargo area and pulse through the frame of the vehicle itself. By morning, with the sun already beating down mercilessly on the asphalt, I was desperate to complete the delivery and get away from whatever was happening with that trailer. I started the engine and pulled back onto the interstate, hoping that the cooler temperatures of Oregon would somehow return things to normal. But as the day progressed and the outside temperature climbed into the triple digits, the breathing became so pronounced that other drivers were giving me strange looks at rest stops, pointing at my trailer and shaking their heads as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The breakthrough came when I stopped for fuel in a small town in Northern California, where an old-timer at the diesel pumps approached me with a concerned expression and asked if I knew my trailer was moving. He'd been watching it for several minutes, he said, and he'd never seen anything like it in 40 years of trucking. The way the whole thing seemed to be breathing like some kind of living creature. When I explained about the refrigerated cargo and the possibility of mechanical issues, he just shook his head and walked away, muttering something about loads that weren't meant to be hauled and trailers that had been in service too long. That afternoon, as I climbed through the mountain passes leading into Oregon, the breathing became so violent that I was afraid the trailer might actually rupture, the aluminum sides bulging outward so far that I could see them in my mirrors, expanding and contracting with increasing urgency, as if whatever was inside was struggling to get out. The temperature outside had reached 104 degrees, and despite the refrigeration unit running at maximum capacity, I could feel heat radiating from the trailer that seemed to come from something other than the summer air. The climax came just as I crested a particularly steep grade, when the breathing suddenly stopped altogether and an eerie silence fell over the entire rig. For a moment I thought perhaps the crisis had passed, that whatever strange phenomenon had been affecting the trailer had finally resolved itself. But then I felt the truck beginning to slow down despite my foot remaining steady on the accelerator. Something was wrong with the weight distribution, as if the cargo inside the trailer was shifting and moving, rearranging itself in ways that defied the laws of physics and the constraints of frozen food packaging. I managed to pull off at the next exit and coast into a parking area overlooking a valley, where I sat in the cab for several minutes, gathering the courage to investigate what was happening behind me. The silence was almost worse than the breathing had been, creating an anticipation that made every nerve in my body feel electrified with dread. When I finally stepped out of the truck, the first thing I noticed was that the trailer was no longer the standard aluminum color it had been when I'd picked it up in Phoenix, but had taken on a pinkish hue that reminded me uncomfortably of living tissue. The rear doors of the trailer were bulging outward slightly, as if tremendous pressure was building up inside, and I could hear a new sound now. Not breathing, but something that sounded almost like whispering. Dozens of voices murmuring in unison from within the cargo area. My hands were shaking as I reached for the door handle, knowing that I had to see what had become of the frozen goods I was supposed to be delivering. But as my fingers touched the metal latch, the whispering stopped abruptly and the trailer gave one final, massive expansion that popped the doors open just a few inches. What I saw through that narrow gap was not the neat rows of frozen food products I expected, but something that looked organic and alive, a mass of tissue that pulsed with its own internal rhythm and seemed to be generating the heat that had been radiating from the trailer all along. I slammed the door shut immediately and secured the latch, then climbed back into the truck and drove straight to the delivery address without stopping, desperate to get the trailer unloaded and away from me as quickly as possible. The receiving dock at the warehouse was busy that evening, with several other trucks waiting to be unloaded, but when the dock workers opened my trailer, they found nothing unusual, just the standard frozen goods exactly as listed on the manifest. They unloaded everything efficiently and professionally, commenting on how well-maintained the refrigeration had kept everything despite the heat wave. And within an hour I was driving away with an empty trailer that seemed completely normal once again. The Empty Berth, from Marcus Thompson. The first thing any trucker will tell you about sleeping on the road is that your cab becomes sacred space. That little berth behind the driver's seat, cramped as it might be, transforms into your bedroom, your sanctuary, your one slice of home in 800,000 miles of asphalt and diesel fumes. So when I climbed into that Peterbilt 379 at the depot in Bakersfield and found the sleeper compartment stripped bare, just 4 metal walls and a bare frame where the mattress should have been, I knew something was wrong. The dispatcher, a thin man named Kellerman with nervous eyes that never quite met mine, had been insistent about this particular run. Portland to Miami, straight through, with a trailer full of medical supplies that couldn't wait for the regular rotation. The pay was double my usual rate, which should have been the first red flag, but I'd been behind on my mortgage payment since the divorce, and desperation makes fools of us all. When I asked about the missing mattress, Kellerman just shrugged and said the previous driver had requested its removal for reasons he didn't care to discuss. The truck itself was immaculate otherwise, a pristine example of American engineering with chrome that gleamed like mirrors and an interior that still smelled faintly of new leather and pine air freshener. The engine purged with a deep, satisfied rumble that spoke of meticulous maintenance, and the dashboard glowed with the soft amber readouts of a vehicle in perfect health. But that empty sleeping compartment nagged at me like a splinter under the skin, a wrongness that seemed to pulse with its own particular darkness. I'd planned to stop at a truck supply store and buy a replacement mattress, but the delivery schedule was tight, and every mile I drove took me further from civilization and deeper into the kind of empty highway that stretches between small towns, like a void between stars. The summer heat had been brutal all day, but as evening approached and I climbed into the mountains of eastern Oregon, the temperature began to drop with the sun, and a cold mist started to gather in the valleys below. By 10 o'clock, fatigue was pulling at my eyelids like lead weights, and the white lines of the highway had begun to blur and dance in my peripheral vision. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, pushing the legal limits, and I knew I needed rest whether I had a proper bed or not. A truck stop appeared in my headlights like a gift from heaven, one of those all-night places with 2 bright fluorescent lights and coffee that could strip paint, surrounded by the dark silhouettes of sleeping big rigs. I pulled into an empty space at the far edge of the lot, away from the noise and light of the main building, and shut down the engine. The sudden silence felt profound after hours of road noise and diesel rumble, broken only by the soft ticking of cooling metal and the distant hum of refrigerated trailers. I climbed into the back, staring at that bare sleeping compartment with its naked metal frame and wondering how I was going to get any rest on such an unforgiving surface. But exhaustion is a powerful drug, and I'd slept in worse places during my early years on the road. I pulled a sleeping bag from my gear and spread it over the metal frame, using my jacket as a pillow and settling in as best I could. The frame was narrow and cold, pressing against my ribs and spine in ways that promised a restless night. But sleep came anyway, pulling me down into darkness like water closing over my head. I dreamed of driving through endless tunnels carved from living rock, the walls pressing closer with each mile until the trailer could barely fit through the narrowing passage. In the dream, I could hear something moving in the sleeper compartment behind me, a wet sliding sound like meat across metal. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there but empty space and that bare metal frame gleaming in the dashboard lights. I woke to the sound of scratching, a rhythmic scraping that seemed to come from directly beneath me. My watch showed 2:30 in the morning, and the truck stop had grown quiet except for the occasional rumble of a late-night arrival. The scratching continued, metal on metal, as if something were trying to claw its way up through the floor of the sleeper compartment. I lay perfectly still, afraid to move, straining my ears in the darkness and trying to convince myself it was just the cooling truck settling on its springs. But the sound was too regular, too purposeful, and it seemed to follow a pattern that suggested intelligence rather than random mechanical noise. Scratch, 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 pause, scratch, 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 pause, like a code being tapped out from somewhere below. I reached for the light switch, my hand trembling slightly, and when the interior lights flickered on, the scratching stopped immediately, as if whatever was making it knew it had been discovered. The sleeping compartment looked exactly as it had before. 4 metal walls in that bare frame, but now I noticed something I hadn't seen earlier. There were marks on the floor, shallow scratches in the metal that formed crude symbols or letters, though I couldn't make out their meaning in the dim light. They looked fresh, the metal bright and unoxidized where it had been scraped away. And they definitely hadn't been there when I'd first inspected the truck. I climbed out of the sleeper and grabbed a flashlight from my gear, returning to examine the marks more closely. What I saw made my blood run cold. They were letters, scratched deep into the metal flooring, and they spelled out a single word repeated over and over in shaky, desperate script. Help. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the scratches were on the underside of the floor, as if someone had been trapped beneath the sleeping compartment and had clawed the message from below. The rational part of my mind tried to find explanations. Maybe the previous driver had done this as some kind of prank, or maybe the marks were older than they appeared, left by some previous occupant during a moment of claustrophobia or panic. But even as I told myself these things, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, and the temperature in the cab seemed to drop by 10 degrees. I was so focused on the scratched messages that I almost missed the sound of the trailer doors opening behind me. It was just a soft click, barely audible over the ambient noise of the truck stop. But I'd been hauling freight long enough to recognize it instantly. Someone was getting into my trailer. I grabbed the flashlight and climbed out of the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel as I made my way to the back of the rig. The trailer doors were indeed open, swinging slightly in the night breeze, though I was certain I'd checked the locks before settling in for the night. I shone the flashlight into the cargo area, expecting to see boxes of medical supplies, but instead found myself looking at something that made no sense. The trailer was filled with mattresses, dozens of them, all stacked neatly from floor to ceiling. But these weren't new mattresses. They were old and stained, bearing the imprints of bodies and the dark blotches of things I didn't want to identify. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, I heard footsteps on gravel behind me. I turned to find Kellerman walking toward me out of the darkness, but something was wrong with his appearance. He moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like a marionette controlled by an inexpert puppeteer, and his face was pale and slack in the beam of my flashlight. "You weren't supposed to look in there," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "The drivers never look in there. They just drive and sleep and deliver their cargo without questions. But you had to be different, didn't you? You had to be curious." I backed away from him, my hand moving instinctively toward the cab door, but more figures were emerging from the shadows between the parked trucks. Other drivers, I realized. Men and women I'd seen around the truck stops and loading docks, but all moving with that same puppet-like stiffness, their eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights like mirrors. "The mattresses need to be seasoned," Kellerman continued, his voice taking on a sing-song quality that raised goosebumps on my arms. "They need the dreams and fears and exhaustion of the drivers who sleep on them. That's what makes them special. That's what makes them valuable to our buyers. But sometimes a driver gets too comfortable, sleeps too deeply, dreams too vividly, and then they become part of the mattress itself, absorbed into the foam and springs until there's nothing left but impressions and stains." I didn't wait to hear more. I lunged for the cab door and hauled myself inside, slamming the locks and firing up the engine in one fluid motion. The diesel roared to life and I threw the transmission into gear, not caring about the trailer or its cargo of nightmare mattresses. The passenger with painted lids. From Marcus, the stretch of Interstate 40 between Amarillo and Oklahoma City has always been my bread and butter. A reliable run that pays decent and keeps me moving through familiar territory. I've been hauling freight along this corridor for the better part of 15 years, and in all that time, I thought I'd seen every kind of hitchhiker, stranded motorist, and roadside oddity the highway had to offer. The night I picked up the woman near the Shamrock truck stop, with her perfectly still posture and those eyes that never once opened during our entire journey together, taught me that the road still held mysteries I wasn't prepared to understand. It was one of those late October evenings when the air carried the first real bite of approaching winter, and the sky had taken on that peculiar purple-black color that seems to absorb the glow from truck stop lights and roadside neon. I was pulling a load of manufactured goods bound for a distribution center outside Tulsa, running about 2 hours behind schedule due to a mandatory rest period I'd miscalculated. The Peterbilt's diesel engine hummed with that steady, reassuring rhythm that had become the soundtrack to my professional life, and the cab's interior glowed softly from the dashboard lights and the occasional sweep of oncoming headlights. She was standing just beyond the main lighting of the truck stop, positioned near the on-ramp in a way that suggested she'd been waiting there for some time. Even from a distance, there was something unnaturally still about her posture, the way she stood with her hands clasped in front of her and her head tilted slightly downward. She wore a dark coat that seemed to blend with the shadows around her, and as I downshifted and began to slow the rig, I noticed that she didn't wave or make any of the usual gestures that hitchhikers use to flag down passing vehicles. She simply stood there as motionless as a statue, somehow conveying her need for transportation through pure presence alone. The CB radio had been quiet for the past hour, carrying only the occasional burst of static and the distant chatter of drivers still miles away. As I brought the truck to a stop beside her, the air brakes releasing with their characteristic hiss, I found myself studying her through the passenger side window. She appeared to be middle-aged, with graying hair pulled back in a simple style, and her face held an expression of serene calm that seemed almost meditative. What struck me most immediately was that her eyes remained closed, not squeezed shut as though she were concentrating or sleeping, but gently closed in a way that looked perfectly natural and yet somehow deliberate. When I rolled down the window to speak with her, she turned her head toward the sound with an accuracy that seemed impossible for someone who couldn't see. Her voice, when she asked if I might be traveling east toward Oklahoma, was soft and measured, carrying a slight accent that I couldn't quite place. There was something soothing about the way she spoke, each word carefully chosen and delivered with a precision that reminded me of old radio announcers or perhaps school teachers from a bygone era. I told her I could take her as far as the Oklahoma City area, and she nodded once, expressing her gratitude in that same gentle, measured tone. As she climbed into the cab with movements that were surprisingly sure and graceful for someone navigating with closed eyes, I expected her to explain her unusual condition. Perhaps she was blind, I reasoned, though her earlier accuracy in turning toward my voice suggested otherwise. Maybe she suffered from some kind of light sensitivity that required her to keep her eyes shut during nighttime hours. But as we pulled back onto the highway and settled into the rhythm of long-distance travel, she offered no explanation, and something about her demeanor discouraged casual questions. The miles rolled by beneath us as we traveled through the Texas Panhandle, the landscape visible only as an endless procession of fence posts, reflective mile markers, and the distant lights of isolated farms. My passenger sat with perfect posture in the sleeper berth's passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap and her head held level, facing forward as though she were watching the road ahead, through eyelids that never once fluttered or showed any sign of opening. The heater hummed quietly, mixing warm air with the ever-present scent of diesel, fuel, and the faint aroma of whatever cleaning products the truck stop shower facilities used. What began to unsettle me as we passed through the small towns of McLean and Shamrock was how, perfectly, she seemed to anticipate the truck's movements. When I would slow for an upcoming curve or begin the gradual deceleration for a construction zone, she would shift her weight or adjust her posture a split second before the change in momentum would naturally require it. When we passed beneath the bright lights of overpasses or through the illuminated zones around larger interchanges, she would turn her head slightly away, as though the light was somehow reaching her through her closed eyelids. The conversation between us had settled into a strange pattern that grew more unsettling with each exchange. She would comment on things outside the truck with an accuracy that seemed impossible for someone who couldn't see. She mentioned the grain elevator we were approaching near Elk City, a full minute before it became visible in the headlights. She asked about the small roadside memorial that marked the site of some long-ago accident, describing details about the artificial flowers and weathered photographs that I could barely make out myself as we passed. When I asked how she knew about these landmarks, she simply smiled that serene smile and said she'd traveled this route many times before as we crossed into Oklahoma, and the landscape began its subtle shift. From the high plains toward the rolling hills of the state's central region, her comments became even more specific and troubling. She began to describe other vehicles on the road before they appeared in my mirrors, mentioning the blue sedan that was approaching from behind, or the delivery truck that was struggling with what appeared to be engine trouble. Each time her observations proved accurate, I felt a growing chill that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the cab's weather stripping. The truly disturbing moment came as we approached a rest area near Weatherford, when she turned toward me with those persistently closed eyes and asked if I'd ever wondered what the road looked like to someone who saw it differently. Her voice carried the same gentle cadence, but there was something beneath it now, a depth that suggested layers of meaning I wasn't sure I wanted to explore. She mentioned that some people became so accustomed to traveling the same routes that they began to see patterns others missed, connections between the travelers who shared these highways across months and years and decades. When I asked what she meant by connections, she described other drivers she claimed to have encountered on this very stretch of highway, providing details about their trucks, their cargo, and their personal stories that she couldn't possibly have known. She mentioned a driver named Carl who hauled livestock and always kept a thermos of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. She knew about Jennifer, who transported medical supplies and talked to herself to stay awake during the long night runs. Most unnervingly, she described drivers who had died in accidents along this route years or even decades earlier, speaking about them as though she'd shared conversations with them just recently. The cab began to feel smaller as her stories continued, the familiar comfort of the highway replaced by a growing sense that I was traveling through territory that operated by rules I didn't understand. The steady rhythm of the diesel engine seemed to take on a different quality, becoming less like the heartbeat of a reliable machine and more like the ticking of some vast, incomprehensible clock. The dashboard lights appeared dimmer, and the sweep of oncoming headlights felt somehow more intrusive, as though each passing vehicle was examining us with an attention that went beyond casual highway observation. As we neared the outskirts of Oklahoma City, with the glow of the metropolitan area beginning to brighten the horizon ahead, she asked if I would be willing to take a slight detour. She directed me toward an exit I'd never used before, leading to a series of backroads that wound through rural areas that seemed far more isolated than their proximity to the city should have allowed. The roads were narrow and poorly lit, lined with aging farmhouses and stretches of empty field that stretched away into darkness on either side. She guided me to a small crossroads marked only by a stop sign and the faint outlines of what might once have been a general store or gas station, now just a crumbling structure barely visible in the headlights. As I brought the truck to a stop, she turned toward me one final time, and for just a moment, I thought I saw the faintest motion behind her eyelids, as though something was moving beneath them in ways that human eyes were never meant to move. She thanked me for the ride in that same measured tone, then stepped down from the cab with the same graceful certainty she'd shown throughout our journey. I watched through the mirrors as she walked away from the truck, not toward any of the dark buildings or along any of the roads, but directly into the empty field beside the crossroads. Her figure remained clearly visible far longer than it should have in the darkness, moving with that same unhurried pace until she finally disappeared into the night. The Static Shepherd. From Jake Morrison. The CB radio had been crackling with static for the better part of 3 hours as I rolled my Peterbilt down Interstate 80 through the Nevada desert, The kind of white noise that makes your eyelids heavy and your mind drift to places it shouldn't go during a night haul. I'd picked up the rig secondhand from a driver named Paulson, who'd gotten spooked by something he wouldn't talk about, selling the whole setup for half what it was worth with eyes that kept darting to the radio mounted beneath my dashboard, like it might bite him. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the asphalt, moonlight painting the sagebrush and Joshua trees in silver and shadow, while my headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness ahead. My cargo of electronics bound for Sacramento sat secure in the trailer behind me, the weight familiar and reassuring as I maintained a steady 70 through the Nevada night. The radio's static rose and fell in gentle waves, almost rhythmic, like breathing or the distant sound of ocean waves against a shore I'd never see from this landlocked highway. That's when I first heard it, buried beneath the white noise like a voice calling from the bottom of a well, a sound that didn't belong to any human throat, sharp and insistent, cutting through the static with an urgency that made my hands tighten on the wheel. It came again, clearer this time, and I realized with a chill that ran down my spine despite the heater's warmth that something was barking through my CB radio. Not barking like a person imitating a dog for some trucker's prank, but the actual sound of canine vocals, deep and resonant with an edge of something wild and hungry that made the hair on my arm stand up beneath my flannel sleeves. I reached for the volume knob, thinking maybe I was picking up some interference from a ranch or a truck stop with guard dogs. But as I turned it down, the barking only seemed to grow more distinct, more purposeful, as if whatever was making the sound could sense my attention. Breaker 19. This is Roadrunner eastbound at mile marker 92. Anybody else hearing this dog on the radio? I called into my handset, my voice sounding smaller than I'd intended in the cab's enclosed space. The barking stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete that even the underlying static seemed to hold its breath. Waiting for something I couldn't name, a voice crackled back, tinged with the lazy drawl of a lifetime spent on the road. That's a negative, Roadrunner. Radio's been quiet as a tomb all night. You might want to check your squelch. Sounds like you're picking up some local interference. But I knew it wasn't interference. Not the way my skin continued to crawl and my eyes kept flicking to the radio's green display, as if expecting to see something other than the channel number glowing back at me. The barking resumed as soon as the other driver signed off, but now it had a different quality, less random and more like a pattern, like Morse code translated into the language of some predator I'd never encountered. Miles rolled beneath my wheels as the sound continued, sometimes fading to barely audible whimpers that tugged at something protective in my chest, other times erupting into howls that seemed to fill the cab despite the volume remaining unchanged. I found myself listening for meaning in the pattern, counting the intervals between barks, trying to understand what message might be hidden in the canine communication flowing through my radio's speakers. The exit for Silver Springs appeared in my headlights, and I felt a sudden compulsion to take it, as if the barking had been guiding me toward this particular off-ramp with its promise of 24-hour fuel and a chance to stretch my legs. The sound grew more excited as I signaled and began to slow, tail-wagging enthusiasm evident even through the electronic reproduction, and I found myself smiling despite the unease that had been building in my chest. The truck stop sat like an island of fluorescent light in the desert darkness, its parking lot half full of sleeping rigs and the diner's windows glowing yellow against the night. I pulled into a space near the back, setting my brakes with a hiss of air pressure, and the barking on the radio immediately changed to what could only be described as pleased panting, the sound of a dog that had successfully led its human to the right place. I climbed down from the cab, my joints protesting after hours behind the wheel, and that's when I saw them. Dogs everywhere, dozens of them, sitting in perfect silence around the parking lot like sentinels. German shepherds and border collies, labs and cattle dogs. Breeds I recognized and others that seemed to exist in the spaces between familiar categories. Their eyes reflected the truck stop's lights in points of gold and green, and every single one of them was watching me with an intelligence that made my mouth go dry. The barking from my radio continued even though I'd shut down the engine, the sound drifting through my open driver's door and mixing with the whisper of desert wind across asphalt. None of the dogs in the parking lot made a sound, their silence more unnerving than any howling would have been, and I began to understand that what I'd been hearing through my CB wasn't coming from any of these flesh and blood animals. A figure emerged from the diner, tall and lean with the unhurried gait of someone who'd been expecting me. He wore a trucker's cap low over eyes I couldn't see, and his smile was too wide for his face, stretching in directions that human expressions weren't meant to go. "You must be the one Shepard's been calling," he said in a voice like gravel sliding down a metal chute. "He's been barking for hours trying to bring you home." The dogs around the parking lot rose as one, still silent, still watching, and I realized that home wasn't a place I wanted to go. Behind me, my radio's barking had taken on a triumphant quality, the sound of a hunting dog that had successfully driven prey toward waiting guns, and I understood with crystalline clarity that whatever had been speaking through my CB had been herding me like livestock toward this moment. This place, this gathering of predators wearing familiar shapes. I backed toward my truck, moving slowly, keeping my hands visible and my breathing steady while my heart hammered against my ribs. The man's smile stretched wider, and in the fluorescent light I could see that his teeth were too sharp and too many, arranged in rows that disappeared back into his throat like a shark's mouth redesigned for terrestrial hunting. "No need to be afraid," he said, his voice carrying the same electronic quality I'd been hearing through my radio. "Shepard just wants to bring you into the pack. You'll like it here. Everyone does eventually." The dogs began to move, not rushing but flowing like water around the parked trucks, cutting off escape routes with the patience of creatures that had hunted together for longer than human memory. My hand found my door handle, and I pulled myself up into the cab while the barking from my radio reaches a crescendo of excitement and hunger, the sound of a pack that scented blood on the wind. I fired up the Peterbilt's engine and threw her into reverse, feeling the satisfying weight of momentum as 18 wheels began to roll. The dogs scattered but didn't retreat, their eyes tracking my movement as I swung toward the exit, and in my mirrors I could see the tall man still standing beside the diner, his impossible smile visible even at distance. The CB fell silent as I reached the highway, but I didn't trust the quiet. I drove through the night with my radio turned off, putting miles between myself and Silver Springs, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being herded, still being guided toward some destination I couldn't see. Every exit sign seemed to glow a little too brightly. Every truck stop looked too welcoming, and in the distance behind me, carried on desert wind or radio waves or something stranger still, I could swear I still heard barking. When I finally stopped for fuel in Sacramento, the attendant asked if I'd had trouble with my CB, said he'd been hearing dog sounds on Channel 19 all morning, coming from somewhere out in the Nevada desert. I told him I didn't know anything about it, but as I climbed back into my cab, I couldn't help but notice that my radio's display was glowing green again, and in the static between stations, something was starting to whimper, the cargo that sang from Eddie Martinez. The dispatcher's voice crackled through my CB radio at midnight, cutting through the steady hum of my Peterbilt's engine as I rolled through the darkness of rural Nebraska. "Eddie, we got a special pickup for you down in Kearney. Livestock transport headed for Chicago. Owner says it's urgent and the pay's double your usual rate." I should have known right then that something wasn't quite right. In 30 years of trucking, I'd learned that when someone offers double pay for a rush job in the middle of the night, there's always a catch. The rain had started falling about an hour earlier, a gentle patter against my windshield that matched the rhythm of my wipers. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated only by my headlights and the occasional flicker of a distant farmhouse. I'd been driving the same route between Denver and Chicago for the better part of a decade, hauling everything from machinery to livestock, but tonight felt different somehow. The air itself seemed heavier, thick with an anticipation I couldn't quite place. When I pulled into the loading dock at Hartwell Farms, the first thing that struck me was how quiet everything was. Most livestock operations, even at this hour, have some kind of activity, some sound of animals settling for the night. But here, the silence was almost complete, broken only by the idle of my engine and the soft whisper of rain on the metal roof of the loading shed. A thin man in coveralls emerged from the shadows, his face gaunt and pale in the yellow glow of the security lights. "You Martinez?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. When I nodded, he gestured toward a large trailer already loaded and waiting. "Your cargo's all set. Just need you to sign here and get moving. The buyer's expecting delivery by dawn." His hand shook slightly as he handed me the clipboard, and I noticed his eyes kept darting toward the trailer as if he couldn't wait for me to take it away. The paperwork was odd, listing the cargo simply as an exotic fowl, live transport. No specific count, no breed information, nothing about feeding schedules or temperature requirements. Usually, livestock transport came with pages of detailed instructions, but this was just a single sheet with the bare minimum. The man watched impatiently as I hitched up the trailer, his nervousness infectious. "Drive careful now," he said as I climbed back into my cab. "That cargo's more valuable than you might think." As I pulled away from the farm, I could feel the weight of the trailer behind me, heavier than I'd expected. The load felt stable enough, but there was something else, a subtle vibration that seemed to travel through the coupling and into my seat. It reminded me of the feeling you get when you're near a large group of birds, that sense of contained energy and movement. I adjusted my mirrors and settled in for the long haul to Chicago, hoping the rain would ease up before I hit the interstate. About 50 miles down the road, that's when I first heard it. At first I thought it might be interference on my radio, a low humming sound that seemed to rise and fall with the rhythm of my engine. I fiddled with the dial, but the static remained the same. Then I realized the sound wasn't coming from my cab at all. It was coming from behind me, from the trailer. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard in all my years of hauling livestock, a harmonious humming that seemed almost musical, as if dozens of voices were singing in perfect unison. I pulled over at the next truck stop and walked back to check on my cargo. The trailer was a standard livestock hauler with ventilation slats along the sides, but when I peered through them, I couldn't make out much in the darkness. The humming continued, rising and falling in waves, and occasionally I could see movement in the shadows, pale shapes shifting back and forth. The sound was strangely beautiful, almost hypnotic, and I found myself standing there longer than I should have, listening to what could only be described as a song. Back on the road, the music from the trailer seemed to grow stronger, more complex. It wasn't just humming anymore, but something that resembled actual melodies, haunting and otherworldly. The sound seemed to seep through my cab, filling every corner with its ethereal presence. I found myself driving to its rhythm, my speed unconsciously matching the tempo of whatever was singing back there. The rain had stopped, but fog was beginning to roll in from the fields, reducing visibility to just a few dozen yards ahead. That's when I started noticing the other cars. At first, it was just one or two vehicles that seemed to be following me, maintaining the same speed and staying just at the edge of my headlight beams. Then more appeared, coming from side roads and on-ramps, all of them falling into line behind my trailer. I counted at least 15 vehicles in my mirrors, all driving in perfect formation, their headlights creating a strange procession through the foggy night. I tried raising someone on the CB, but all I got was static mixed with that same melodic humming. It was as if the song from my trailer was somehow broadcasting itself, overwhelming all other frequencies. The vehicles behind me showed no signs of breaking away or passing, just following in that eerily organized convoy. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I changed lanes, they followed suit, moving like a single organism rather than individual drivers making their own decisions. The fog grew thicker as I approached the Illinois border, and that's when things took a turn that still gives me chills to think about. The humming from my trailer began to change, becoming more urgent, more insistent. Through my mirrors, I could see that the cars following me had turned off their headlights, but somehow they were still there, still maintaining perfect formation, in complete darkness. Even more disturbing, I began to see shapes moving alongside the highway, pale figures that seemed to be running or gliding through the fog, keeping pace with my truck despite the fact that I was doing 70 miles an hour. I radioed for help on the emergency channel, but the only response was that haunting melody growing stronger and more complex. The figures in the fog were becoming more numerous, and now I could see them more clearly in my peripheral vision. They appeared to be human in shape, but moved with an unnatural grace, their movements synchronized with the music emanating from my trailer. Some seemed to be floating inches above the ground, while others moved through the fog itself as if they were part of it. As I crested a hill about 30 miles outside of Chicago, the entire landscape ahead of me was transformed. The fog had settled into the valley below, and rising from it were thousands of pale shapes, all moving in the same flowing, synchronized pattern. The convoy of vehicles behind me had grown to at least 50 cars, all moving silently through the night without their lights on. The music from my trailer had reached a crescendo, a complex symphony that seemed to be conducting this entire supernatural gathering. I knew I had to get off the highway, had to break free from whatever was happening before I reached Chicago. At the next exit, I took a sharp right without signaling, hoping to lose the convoy and get somewhere with lights and people. The vehicles behind me followed without hesitation, taking the exit ramp in perfect single file. The pale figures in the fog seemed to flow along beside us, their movements becoming more agitated as we left the main highway. I found myself on a rural road with no streetlights, just my headlights cutting through the fog and the eerie procession following behind. The music from my trailer reached a pitch that was almost overwhelming, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. I could feel it in my chest, in my bones, as if the melody was trying to take control of my very heartbeat. My hands on the steering wheel began to move in time with the rhythm, and I had to fight to maintain control of my truck. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The music cut off mid-note, leaving only the rumble of my engine and the whisper of fog against my windshield. In my mirrors, I watched as the convoy of vehicles simply vanished, not driving away, but literally disappearing as if they had never been there at all. The pale figures in the fog melted back into the mist, and I was alone on a dark country road with my mysterious cargo. I managed to find my way back to the interstate and complete my delivery in Chicago, just as the sun was rising. The loading dock where I was supposed to drop off the trailer was deserted except for a single man who looked remarkably similar to the farmer back in Nebraska, the same gaunt face and nervous manner. He signed for the delivery without looking at the paperwork, and drove the trailer away before I could ask any questions about what exactly I had been hauling. To this day, I still don't know what was in that trailer. The shipping company claimed no record of the job when I tried to follow up, and Hartwell Farms had apparently been abandoned for years according to county records. Sometimes late at night on long hauls, I think I can still hear echoes of that haunting melody carried on the wind.